in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service within the U.S. Department of Interior, right? That's our problem, that's our role as a environmental lawyer. And so let me start by asking for a handful of you to share what's your favorite federal public land to visit, or to experience. What's Great Lake, okay? Yes, sir?
Junquet.
Oh, Junquet. It's one of our national rainforests. Okay, good. Where do we go? Anything else? No? Yellowstone, okay, good. Anybody else has any? Yosemite, okay. Yosemite? Acadia, all right, good. So a range of different ones. So yeah, excellent. So I'm under here. I've got my Arches National Park. Anybody been to any of the parks out in Utah? Arches, Canyonlands, Zion. Yes. Okay. They're amazing, right? Another of my favorites is the Medicine Bow National Forest in Wyoming. And the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas. So a variety of national parks, national forests, right? They're all managed by different agencies. Anybody been to Mammoth Cave National Park? A bunch of you, okay. How about Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area? Okay. Well, then we're more public lands around here than we thought. How about the Daniel Boone National Forest, which is Red River Gorge, and Natural Bridge State Park is kind of in the midst there, right? Okay. So we have a few more federal public lands here than maybe first comment suggested. Okay, good. So they're not all out west and so forth. So one of the issues about federal public lands is there are many different types governed by many different agencies that serve many different purposes. Let's focus for a moment just primarily on national parks and national forests, because those are the two that are most used by members of the public for recreation and for visitation. National wildlife refuges can be used to a certain degree to the extent that they don't conflict or harm the wildlife refuge part of purposes of those. But for most part, let's focus on national parks and national forests. And which, by the way, is interesting. National forests are they're sources of timber, right? They're for some cutting trees and so forth, but they also serve important ecological and recreational purposes as well. They've got actually great hiking out there and so forth. Okay, so just focusing on those two, we're talking a little bit about thinking about these lands from diverse perspectives, and we spent some time last class period looking at kind of the Native American perspective. So let's talk a little bit now about low-income people of color, low-income members of racial and ethnic minorities in the United States. What do you think is sort of the perspective or experience of those groups with respect to our national parks and our national forests? Do you have any thoughts, observations?
Well, they tend to lack access to them because a lot of them are on like public transportation routes, so especially like low-income areas have a hard time getting into any of these things.
Exactly. So a huge issue. So the data show that primarily these population groups use public lands to a much lesser degree than other groups. And part of it has to do with access, particularly transportation access, if you don't have vehicles, if you don't have money, if there's not public transportation, and that kind of thing. And so if you think about places like Yosemite or Yellowstone or Arches or Zion or places like Acadia and so forth, right, they're beautiful places, but they're not right in the urban areas, and there's not easy public access. Another aspect is that they cost, okay? So all of these have admissions fees, and they're not cheap. Anybody been recently? I mean, you can get an annual pass and so forth, but it's not cheap to go visit, and that doesn't include camping fees or food or other kinds of things. So that's another barrier for lower income populations. Distance from urban areas, and so forth. So there's a great documentary on PBS about our national park system. A Ken Burns documentary, very good, very well done, sort of tediously done, as Ken Burns documentaries are, but he calls it America's great idea, right? And so, or America's best idea, I think, is America's best idea, even more so. There's not even an idea out there that's even better than our national parks. It is true that they are significant, and the data show that our national parks contribute substantially to democracy in the United States. Okay, there's a sort of democracy supporting idea that we have all these amazing environmental places that the public can visit. They're not free, but they're also, it's not only for the wealthy. And yet, one of the problems with that is that there are groups that typically don't find a variety of obstacles and barriers, and many of those are low-income people, people of color, and so forth. And so that ends up being a challenge. And so, for example, one of the issues that has been going on in Los Angeles has been about how to connect, say, for example, Latino and Latina kids in East Los Angeles to the Santa Monica Mountains, to the San Gabriel Mountains, to the Angeles National Forest, and so on and so forth. These great, amazing public lands that are all around the LA area, but very difficult to access. And again, a lot of those kids don't have transportation out there and so forth. And so there are various programs now that are focused on that. But obviously, that is more focused on those public lands that are at least in the urban area generally, in the urban region, the greater metropolitan region. I would not say that those programs have really developed for, say, getting to Yosemite, for example, or going to the Grand Canyon, or some other things like that. So that's just something, just thinking about perspectives, that's something to think about the extent to which these primarily, when we talk about environmental values and recreational values, they are primarily American white, middle class, and upper middle class values. People who have the ability to jump in a car and go camping with the family, 6 states away, right? Or to go spend a lot of resources on hiking and mountain climbing and kayaking and so forth, right? So those kinds of things. Let's just start thinking about that. as we think about those perspectives, it brings us back to how those lands end up being managed and what are the legal standards for that. And so I provided that. By the way, if you weren't here and you haven't seen them, this is the handout. You can pick up a paper copy. That's also on Blackboard, and I emailed it and so forth. But let me read you from our problem number 1 on grasslands and prairie dog conservation, one of the paragraphs from our problem. Although much of the western U.S. is in federal land ownership, the vast majority of lands that support or could support prairie grasslands are in regions dominated by private land ownership. The Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, the Texas Panhandle, and eastern parts of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. Now, those last 4, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico, have substantial federal lands, but more in the central to western parts of the state. And the eastern parts are a lot more like Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma, where it's private ownership primarily. Even the federal lands that support prairie dog habitat are managed by many different agencies, including the Bureau of Land Management, which manages rangelands, the U.S. Forest Service, which manages both national forests and national grasslands, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages national wildlife refuges, the National Park Service, which manages national parks such as the Badlands National Park, which actually has quite a bit of both grassland and prairie dog components, characteristics, and the U.S. Department of Defense, which manages military installations. Federal agencies' efforts to protect prairie dogs vary widely, even within the same agency. Many agencies have significant restoration efforts, but some also engage in eradication under certain circumstances, and often monitoring, implementation, and adaptation by federal agencies are weak. Okay, so basic set of overview facts about this. So if we are looking at the use of federal lands to manage and protect grasslands and prairie dogs, we've got to look at what kind of legal standards govern our management. So now once again, which agency do we represent? U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay, so one type of federal land makes a lot of sense is the national grasslands. However, national grasslands is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. U.S. Forest Service. Okay, and you're like, why? Why the grass? I don't know. I mean, it has to do, somehow or other these were viewed as some sort of like more farming and forest-like activity as opposed to like national parks, which are about humans visiting for recreational purpose, or national wildlife refuges, which are all about sort of fish and wildlife stuff. So anyway, so national grasslands are managed by the U.S. Forest Service, and there are 4 different sources of law. The Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act, okay, which is, this is back in the I think this is in the 30s, 1930s. This was developed in the wake of the Dust Bowl. You all familiar with Dust Bowl? Yes? Another Ken Burns tedious video. Well done, a tedious video, right? Not video, documentary. Okay, so Dust Bowl was this sort of enormous ecological disaster, started in the late 1920s, right about the time of the crash, big stock market crash that led to the Great Depression. Okay, and the Dust Bowl was the result. It was primarily situated in Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and New Mexico, Colorado. So the Great Plains area that had a lot of farming, and it was largely a result of unsustainable agricultural practices, the conversion of grasslands to fields for wheat and corn, primarily, other soybeans, etc., but primarily these crops that were farmed very intensively. The expansion of farmland, so instead of leaving parts, like leaving one field fallow one year while you farm the other, there was, after World War I, there was enormous shortages of food in Europe, which meant that the prices of American farm commodities went sky high, and so you could make a ton of money by just like plowing everything up and just planting as much as possible. Okay, so it was like, just hey, let's do more and more, and you push it to the limits. And there were a lot of not scientifically based, actually sort of anti-scientific, but people believed very strongly that this was actually sustainable. So this was somehow doable, that you could do this and that your land, your water, your topsoil would support it all. Okay? And in retrospect, we know that's totally not true, but that was the idea. And then along came a drought, and that meant there wasn't enough water, but it also meant that it went in drought and then winds, then came along with heat and so forth, right? And it was blowing away the topsoil. Right? And so what happened is people's crops totally failed. People's farms were seized by plagues. And we're now in the period of the Great Depression, where there's like the economy's totally in the tank. A quarter of the American population is unemployed. Right? There are people roaming the country, homeless and hungry, and so forth. Right? This is what's going on in the Great Depression. And meanwhile, farms are being seized by the banks because they're going under, because the crops have failed. And there's this enormous, these enormous clouds of dust and dirt, soil being lifted off the land, that go on for days and days and weeks. People die from it. Right? I mean, they're essentially being smothered by these big clouds of dust. Right? You see this stuff coming and people running indoors and they're getting in the houses and so forth. Cars and trucks are totally buried by this stuff. Right? People have fled their cars and then they come out a couple days later and the car's totally buried under the soil. And this has enormous regional effects. We're not just talking about just these local areas, but this has regional effect. So there's a point at which Congress is having some hearings on a proposal to create a soil conservation service and to try to do something about protecting the soil. By the way, much of our ability to feed ourselves and to sustain our economy is based on just this much topsoil. Okay? Good, healthy topsoil is necessary to grow crops, and it's a very, it's an amazingly, I won't say it's fragile because it's not. It's actually pretty resilient, but it's an amazing limited resource that we depend on, really extensively. And here's all blown away, and that's bad, right? That's a bad thing, right? Okay. And so they're having these hearings, and the members of Congress are like, the federal government can't do anything, and we shouldn't be interfering with farming practices in the private market. And by the way, this is the new deal, right? This is Roosevelt's president, and so on and so forth. I think by this time, or if not, he's coming, right? He's coming, and so forth. But this is people are talking about we need to do something about the economy, about the Great Depression, and they're saying, hey, we can't do anything. And while the hearings are going on, this massive black dust cloud from the Great Plains, from Kansas and Oklahoma, arrives in Washington, D.C. Okay, and you can watch the videos online. I mean, it's amazing. Okay, this has come from all the way. How far is that, right? Okay, it's got to come over Kentucky, right? Okay, so this massive dust cloud, all the way from Kansas and Oklahoma, arrives in Washington, D.C. And I mean, I think it's like God saying, "Hey, wake up, folks!" You know, and so they do. They pass the Soil Conservation Service Act. Okay, so again, it's, we talk about feedback loops. Sometimes nature provides us harsh feedback loops about our environmentally unsustainable practices. And so that was one of them. Okay, so we get the Soil Conservation Service created, which is now called. Then eventually became the national. Became the. Oh, sorry. I'm just trying to weigh that log out. All right, hold on. So eventually became the Soil and Water Conservation Service, and is now the Natural Resource Conservation Service. It resides in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it is actually one of the most popular agencies in the federal government, especially with farmers, because it provides financial and technical resources to farmers to do sustainable agriculture. So it doesn't regulate them, it doesn't, if you take the money, you have to do what they say, right? But it provides them with resources to do sustainable agriculture. Okay, so at around the same time, we are getting some authority for the Department of Agriculture to develop a program of land conservation and land utilization to control soil erosion, conserve surface and subsurface moisture, protect the watershed of navigable streams, and protect public lands, health, safety, and welfare. And so basically, the government acquires, under the Bankhead-Jones Act, 3.8 million acres as national grasslands. And part of the idea is we're going to manage them as grasslands to allow not wheat and not corn and not soybeans and not any of the, grazing by large herd of cattle and that kind of stuff. They're going to be managed as grasslands to stabilize the soils, to protect the soils, to protect the water quality in the watersheds and so forth. Okay? So that is a set of standards. Notice how broadly that's worded. There's some specific purposes, right? So if, for example, the Department of Agriculture wanted to manage the national grasslands for farming, is that authorized? No, it does not appear in that list, right? They want to manage it for mining. Is that authorized? No, it does not appear in that list. Right? Does everybody see that? Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about a statute that identifies specific purposes for which lands are acquired by the federal government and managed as national grasslands. Now, don't get carried away. Lots and lots of federal lands that can be, in which we can have farming or livestock grazing or mining, just not these, right? Okay. Then, there are two statutes that guide the National Forest Service in management of all of its lands. All the Forest Service lands, so that includes national forest as well as national grasslands. And one's the National Forest Management Act of 1976, and this is mostly about preparing management plans, and it talks about multiple use and sustained yield, coordination of outdoor recreation, range, it's livestock grazing, right? Timber, cutting the trees, watershed, wildlife and fish, and wilderness, okay, a wide range. It makes reference to multiple use and sustained yield. And multiple use and sustained yield is known commonly in environmental law as MUSI, M-U-S-Y, MUSI. Okay, multiple use and sustained yield. You see this a bunch? Not mucus, sorry, not MUSI. And it is, it appears in a number of different statutes, but the classic is the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act of 1960, which is, directs the U.S. Forest Service to manage and administer the national forest in a sustainable manner to provide for outdoor recreation, range, timber, watershed, and wildlife and fish purposes. Now, how possible is it in any given management decision for the U.S. Forest Service to achieve all five of those? No, right? I mean, if you think about it for a second, you're like, okay, there are trade-offs. But you can't have the cattle grazing and also have, the wildlife and fish being protected. If you have outdoor recreation while the trees are being cut, right? There's trade-offs, right? This is the example. This is an example. This is a classic example of exactly what I mentioned a few class periods ago about what Congress does. Is they adopt a statute with a broad mandate that is totally impossible to achieve, and then it's up to the agency to figure out how to achieve it. So what the U.S. Supreme Court has said is that MUSI means that the agency is required to maximize each and every one of these 5 goals, because that's what Congress has said. And again, you look at and some of you are looking at me like, huh? And it's like, exactly. I mean, that's something that people in law say that is like totally irrational and makes no sense. But you can just wave your hand and say, legally, this must be so. And right, okay, so that's our problem. Is that each and every one of these is a purpose of the national forest, and we're to manage the forest for these multiple uses, and yet there's no clear direction about how that's supposed to go, either from Congress or from the courts. And so what does that mean? You know what that means? It means it ends up being the agency that decides, right? And when the agency makes a choice, what happens after that? The agency makes a choice, and what's the next thing that happens? What's that? Okay, so they're going to notice a comment when they make a decision, okay? Let's assume they make a decision, and then what happens after they pick something? Yes, they get sued. They get sued. There's a lawsuit, right? And you can pull out the Administrative Procedure Act, right? And you can pull out the National Forest Management Act, and you pull out MUSI, and you start drafting a complaint that says that this is illegitimate, that it is arbitrary and capricious, and abuse of discretion, and otherwise not in accordance with the law. And you particularly want to attack, they didn't consider the relevant factors, right? They didn't apply, or they didn't consider the evidence, right? It's not supported by substantial evidence in the record. You want to say their interpretation is contrary to what Congress has intended, the language of the statute. They didn't follow the proper procedures, etc. Right? Does everybody start seeing how these pieces fit together in environmental law? Right? Okay, so of course that's what happens. Now, the reality is that a lot of times the courts will be relatively deferential to the agency, so long as it looks like the agency really thoughtfully considered what they were supposed to do and made a reasoned decision supported by evidence. Right? So again, you see that pattern. If the agency looks like they did that, then the courts defer. If it looks like the agency just made a political choice that isn't very well supported, they're likely to overturn what the agency did and send it back and say, hey, do it better again the next time. Right? So that's the gist. But this is not, these two tell us that yes, the watershed benefits and wilderness benefits of grasslands can be protected by the Forest Service. And they can tell us that the wildlife and fish purposes can be achieved by protecting the prairie dogs, right? Those are purposes, but they also bump up against the outdoor recreation, the timber, and the range purposes. So basically, in developing a strategic analysis of this problem, you're going to want to say exactly that, right? You see, when you get down to the heart of it, don't sort of dance around and say, oh, you see, it's so broad and so forth. No, these two purposes, watershed and wildlife and fish, help us. The other three do not help us. Right? So the range, because we know the cattle and the prairie dogs aren't getting along very well, right? The timber, well, you know, that's maybe not super unhelpful, but it could be, cutting down the trees and getting in there and so forth. And then outdoor recreation. If humans are coming up against, you know, the plague and the prairie dogs and so forth, or they're trampling over grasslands, that's not so good, right? So we want to say exactly that. Then the U.S. Forest Service regulation. So this is important because this is how the agencies interpreted these regulations, and particularly with respect to the national grasslands, this one has a particular focus on ecosystems, right? A regulation for ecosystem management and maintaining viable populations of management indicator species, right? So what does that mean? It means the agency, this is how the agency is going about implementing its legal responsibilities with respect to grasslands, and so this is actually helpful to us. This is helpful because it says they're going to be focused on grasslands as ecosystems, and it says that prairie dogs, which we know from our facts are keystone species, are very likely to be picked as management indicator species, and therefore the grasslands are going to be managed for their health and viability. Right? Does everybody see that? Okay. So on the whole, we have maybe not so helpful statutory language, but some pretty helpful regulatory language.
So when you say it's helpful or it helps us, you mean like it gives like authority or something to stand on to take an action or make a proposal or whatnot?
Right. Okay. So exactly where I'm going with this. Okay. So once again, Assistant Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, what legal authority do you have with respect to any of this? Zero. None whatsoever. Right? Because this is all about which agency? Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service. Okay, so now that doesn't mean legal analysis is irrelevant. Our legal analysis is actually going to be very important here. Okay, so what are we going to do with our legal analysis? We say there's authority to protect and manage for the grasslands as ecosystems or viable ecosystems, and for the prairie dogs, conservation of the prairie dogs as a management indicator species. And what are we going to do with that analysis? So practically, what are we going to do? Yes. You're going to set up a meeting. You're going to get on a plane. You're going to get on the metro in Washington D.C. and you're going to make it right over to the Forest Service, to whoever is responsible. Maybe you're going to go out to out west to the Great Plains and talk to the people who are actually doing the management of the grasslands in those areas, right? And you're going to talk to them about look at this legal analysis, and we want you to use this authority that you have in coordination, in collaboration with us. Okay? Right. So now we're going to start getting into this idea of multi-stakeholder collaboration, and it starts. But this is not the most important thing, but our entry point at the moment is multiple federal agencies. How can the multiple federal agencies collaborate on a strategy that will actually be meaningful? Okay, so let me roll down. The top here is the National Forest Service. These are the standards for the management of the National Forest. They're the same as the grasslands, except you don't have the Bankhead Act, right? Okay, so we don't need to do anything more there. Same thing. National Wildlife Refuges. This is us. We can do this. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we're supposed to conserve, manage, and restore the fish, wildlife, and plant resources and their habitats found in the refuges for the benefit of present and future generations of Americans. We allow wildlife-dependent recreational uses if it's compatible. If not, they're not allowed. Grazing's not allowed. Okay, etc. Anything that would materially interfere with the wildlife, etc. Right? Okay, so the point here is that national wildlife refuges are specifically established by Congress to be managed for wildlife and the systems, the habitats to support them. So this is tremendous authority for us, for our agency, to manage our national wildlife refuges for grassland conservation and prairie dog conservation, right? So we're going to do our part. But the number of national wildlife refuges in this area is limited. They're going to play important roles, and we can make that the case, but it's obviously very fragmented, and there are lots of other lands that would not be within the national wildlife refuge system. So let's see about the national parks. So one source of law is the National Park Service Organic Act, which, by the way, we're now at 103, 104, 105 years, something. The National Park Service has been around 104, I think. 303. Okay. So I know we had a Kate in my environmental law class when I turned 100 sometime. Anyway, all right. So idea here is conserve the scenery, natural and historic objects, and wildlife in the system units, and to provide for the enjoyment of scenery, natural and historic objects, and wildlife in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Unimpaired is a really legally important word. Future generations. Okay? But notice it is not just ecosystems, but also historic and cultural objects, scenery, right? So there's a lot more going on in national parks than just ecology, and a lot more than just wildlife. But nonetheless, the national parks can be an important place for conservation, but this is a place where recreation is key. So unimpaired is key, but also the use and enjoyment of the parks, right? So that the enjoyment part says, hey, the public comes. Well, one of the things we know is that the public enjoyment of the national parks has grown substantially, and that's actually now impairing the parks. Right? So Zion, for example, where I was in May, has so many visitors now. They're having to figure out some sort of system for managing, and it's very controversial because what do you do if people want to come? But on the other hand, it's just simply beyond the park's capacity anymore because they just have so many visitors. It's become so popular. And there's other things. There's people who publish articles about like loving our parks to death and that kind of thing. But the point here is the national parks have have a broader set of purposes that include enjoyment as well as leaving them unimpaired for future generations, and that creates a tension. Also, each national park has its own establishment act. I mentioned that previously, but that is going to guide the management of each park specifically. And then finally, we have the BLM lands. This is Bureau of Land Management, and there's a Federal Land and Policy Management Act that applies here. And so this is interesting because on one hand, they have a multiple use and sustained yield mandate, same kind of mandate as the National Forest. And there's also some language about that they have to be managed in a manner that will protect the quality of the ecological and environmental values that, where appropriate, will preserve and protect certain public lands in their natural conditions. However, practically, BLM lands, because they don't have specific purposes tied to them, okay, this is kind of mostly a lot of open range land in the West. They managed primarily for grazing and livestock, energy and mineral extraction, and other non-ecological uses. So that's practically how a lot of BLM lands are managed. Of course, this is a quote down here about some of the tensions about that. Practically the many different purposes for which BLM lands must be operated under the law practically means sometimes you are going to trade off one goal entirely for the other. So you may, for example, end up destroying all the ecological value of certain parts of certain BLM lands in order to achieve other uses intended by Congress. This is sort of the theory behind this. Okay. Now, it also is under what circumstances, what's the basis for the agency making that decision, and so forth. And there are plenty of cases where the BLM decision is overturned by the agency for its failure to manage the lands for ecological conservation and so forth. But having said that, in my observation, the BLM is more likely to lose on NEPA than they are on the substantive management standards. Where BLM gets in trouble more is that it fails to consider the environmental consequences of its management decision. It basically wants to soft pedal it. Doesn't want anybody to really realize that the mining and the grazing and so forth are going to have these substantial adverse environmental impacts. And so they either don't do an EIS or they do it poorly, and then they get smacked by the courts for having not followed NEPA. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. All right. So again, there's a whole bunch of BLM land out in the areas where we're looking at. They're not. I mean, it's not like further west, but there are BLM lands. And so the question is, to what extent could we recruit the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Bureau of Land Management to work with us cooperatively for a grassland and prairie dog conservation program, management program. Right? Is everybody following what I'm sort of saying here? So when you sort of think about solutions, what it tells us is, bottom line, okay? Bottom line. The greatest authority to do that is in the National Wildlife Refuges and in the National Grasslands. Does everybody see why that conclusion flows from the analysis we just did? You see that? The National Wildlife Refuges and the National Grasslands have the greatest legal authority directing those agencies to manage for grassland conservation and prairie dog conservation. Next, after that, are probably the national parks, because of the ecology and non-impairment aspects of the National Parks Organic Act. Less so are the national forests, right? National forests, because MUSI applies, and there's no Bankhead Act. Right? Does everybody see that? So we got MUSI applies to the grasslands, but then you also have the language of the Bankhead Act, right? With the forest, you have just MUSI in the National Forest Management Act. Basically, so there's some legal authority for the Forest Service to manage for grassland conservation and prairie dog conservation, but it's less so. And then by the time you get to the BLM lands, it's even less, right? But the BLM lands are managed more for extractive purposes, grazing, livestock, mining, other resource extraction activities. Is that everybody following? Okay. So that's the bottom line analysis of what we can find in the statutes and regulations in terms of federal agency management authority to support grassland programs. Okay. So that leads us to how can we possibly get more participation in our efforts, right? I mean, because remember our goal, or what we've been charged with, is to come up with some sort of prairie conservation and grassland conservation and prairie dog conservation program effort, right? And so we clearly need those federal agencies, but we're going to clearly need more than that. Where we're going for class on Wednesday is private land conservation, like the private sector. But to sort of build the bridge, we're now going to look at the lessons from Mono Lake, because the Mono Lake case, National Audubon Society versus Superior Court, is regularly ranked as one of the 10 most important environmental cases of the 20th century. So I know we're now in the 21st century, and so maybe it's, as time goes on, maybe it has less. But it was really significant because it was the use of a common law doctrine, very ancient common law doctrine that goes all the way back to ancient Rome, called the public trust doctrine, to limit extractive uses of the environment that were harming the ecosystem, were harming the ecology of Mono Lake and the Mono Lake Basin. And it really actually had a pretty significant impact. But what I want us to get at is why. How is it that it had such a significant impact? And so you're going to find a bunch of writing out there about the public trust doctrine, about the law, about these broad principles, the principles of conservation and so forth. All very nice. But what my article is meant to show you is all these things we've been talking about, things like politics, like financial resources, like public engagement, and multi-stakeholder collaboration, can actually turn out really big parts of this. And so we've got to pay attention to those too. We can't just sort of say, oh, if we just get the right legal decisions, it's all going to happen, right? Because one of the things that happened here when we get to this is after the California Supreme Court declared that the environmental impacts on Mono Lake had to be considered, nothing was done to actually protect Mono Lake for 10 years. And it actually took all those other things to get to a solution. So let's take a look at what's going on here. Okay? So Monterey Lake controversy. So this is about environmental saving ecologically valuable but threatened lake from destruction, and there have been some really impressive improvements in ecological conditions that have resulted from this. Okay, this picture from Monterey Lake when I was last out there, we're talking about on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevadas. Okay, so sort of south of Reno, and really just over the mountain from Yosemite. Okay, so if you go to Yosemite, all you gotta do is just go out the east end of the park, and boom, you're right there at Monterey Lake. And so what's going on is Los Angeles wanted water from the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they obtained water rights to take the water from the feeder streams of Monterey Lake and pipe it down to Los Angeles, and the lake was drying up. So this is LA in the 80s, 70s or 80s, and this is one part of the system of aqueducts and pipes that took the water down. And so, as I said, this was a path-breaking case using the public trust doctrine, and the case was called National Audubon Society versus Superior Court. And the question is, does environmental law matter? Does environmental law actually achieve environmental conservation? And my main point is, not by itself it doesn't, okay? So you can't just sort of say the law is going to save us here. So, basic paradigm in environmental law, which you should now be well familiar with, is that the answer to environmental protection is legislate, then regulate, then litigate, right? And this is pretty standard stuff, which we'll study here, and so forth. And that ties in with the sort of legal centrism sort of theory, which sort of says the law changes behavior and directs what happens in society. Legal peripheralism is a different kind of concept, which says it's sort of market-oriented and says kind of informal non-government ordering of society is much more important than the law in shaping behavior. And then there's legal pluralism, which is sort of a social reform sort of thing, which says there's a multitude of non-legal forces that shape both society and law. And this is really sort of where this falls, is the sort of legal pluralist idea. Okay? That there's more to it than you might think. Okay, so we saw that. That. And so this just shows that environmental conservation is at the center, and there's a whole bunch of other things going on, which we're going to talk about, that are important contributors to environmental conservation efforts. And so I'm going to talk about the lake, the public trust doctrine, and then how we got from the case to the actual conservation. So this is some pictures of Monterey Lake, more pictures of Monterey Lake, eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada mountains, eastern California, more pictures, more pictures. Okay, so Monterey Lake is a terminal lake that has no outlet. It gets snowmelts from the Sierra Nevada mountains that end up through 5 feeder streams into the lake. Because it has no outlet, it's very saline, very alkaline, and very sulfurous, because all that stuff that comes into the lake has nowhere to go. So as the water from the lake evaporates, all those minerals and substances remain in the lake. It has a very heavy feel, very reflective. Okay, it looks like a big sort of mirror, really, in many ways. There's an estimated 285 million tons of chemicals dissolved in Monterey Lake. And prior to LA diverting the Monterey Lake feeder stream waters, the lake was about a third as salty as the ocean, but by 1981, it was 3 times as salty as the ocean, because they were taking all the water from the feeder streams, and so it just meant you had more concentration of stuff. It's too saline to support fish. You have lots of algae and microscopic plants blooming, and they, in turn, support as many as 7 trillion brine shrimp. Okay, these are not at all the stuff that you order at Red Lobster. Okay, so we're not talking about those kinds of shrimp, but they little tiny things that are near the surface of the lake, and then millions of alkali flies feed on this. And when I was there, you can see all the alkali flies. Okay, these alkali means that they are flies that are adapted to alkaline environments, like you get, right? Because all that those chemicals and stuff. And then there's a range of riparian vegetation and trout and so forth in the feeder streams. So there's some pretty pictures. These aren't great pictures, but this is supposed to be all the alkali flies and birds feeding on them. These are some pictures I took. So this is all flies feeding on the top, and then the birds feeding on the flies. Okay, there's one. There's California gold right there, and right there you see it's having lunch, and so forth. Monterey Lake is one of the 4 most important shorebird habitats in the U.S. It's internationally recognized. It is the breeding habitat for 25% of the world's California gull population. In the U.S., only the Great Salt Lake supports more California gulls. It's an essential migratory stop for avocets, phalaropes, and grebes. Okay, it's a really important place on the Pacific Flyway for migratory birds. And there's another picture. Some of these are from the Monterey Lake Committee's website, and they're not super great. So you've seen in the previous pretty pictures the tufa formations. These are limestone formations that are the towers and spires that rise from the lake, and they're basically formed from sort of calcium deposits from water that is bubbling up. There's groundwater that's coming into the lake as well, right? And it's bubbling up, and then it forms these calcium deposits that over time grow in a form. Monterey Lake has the world's most distinctive tufa formations. Okay, this is a place where Ansel Adams, you guys know who Ansel Adams was? Famous photographer. See some of you go to the mall or go to the furniture stores, you see the pictures of the prints of Ansel Adams pictures and so forth. Ansel Adams went in and photographed Monterey Lake because it's really distinctive. So these are some tufa. Again, these are pictures I took when I was out there. And you see how shiny the lake looks, right? Reflective and so forth. And pretty blue sky. And it's an unusual, evocative, eerie landscape. Mark Twain called it the loneliest tenant of the loneliest spot on earth. Okay, so Mark Twain was out there. But it's not really so lonely now because it gets lots of visitors because of the Monterey Lake Committee and the Monterey Lake. So about the Monterey Lake case, the National Audubon Society case. So there was a time when it is kind of very otherworldly. Right? So you could totally film some sort of like sci-fi picture, right? So you could film a sci-fi film out there. But again, now it gets lots of visitors. So that's the fog on it. So what was happening? In 1940, the LA Department of Water and Power obtained a permit to appropriate nearly the entire flow of 4 out of the 5 feeder streams, and what is now referred to as the Water Board granted the permit, and this relies on the prior appropriation doctrine of water rights, which we actually don't really need to know that much about, but the Department of Water and Power, by about 1970, was diverting approximately 100,000 acre-feet of water on average from the Mono Basin. Okay, 100,000 acre-feet of water. What's an acre-foot of water? It is the amount of water that it takes to flood an acre of land 1 foot deep. Okay, so it's a lot of water. Okay? A lot of water. They only used about half, so they got the permit in 1940. For about 30 years, they just used half of their permitted amount. And then by 1970, LA had grown so much, and the demand for water had grown so much that they upped it to the entire amount. And so you can see, up here is Mono Lake, and down here is Los Angeles. So this is the state of California diverting the water all the way down. You see the pipe there. So, okay? So the lake dropped from 1940 to 1980. It went from 6416 feet above sea level to 6376 feet above sea level. Perhaps more, something easier to relate to is that the surface area of the lake shrunk by 1/3. Okay, so think that you now have only 2/3 of the lake you had in terms of surface area. The chemical composition increased in salinity, and the California gull became endangered by the decrease in the lake level. Why? Okay, so it's because the gulls breed and nest on islands in the lake. Okay, they have their young there, they have these nests with the eggs and so forth, and because of the drop in the lake level, the islands had then become connected to the mainland, which meant that predators had access, particularly coyotes. So by 1979, the coyotes had reached the breeding area, and by 1981, almost all of the infant birds did not survive to adulthood. Okay, so what does that mean? It means eventually, any California gull that breeds and nests at Mono Lake, which is what 25% of the world's California gull population, is going to die off, right? Eventually, right? Because all their young is going to die. Eventually, they're going to die of old age, and so it's pretty significant. And so you see, this is what it looked like, and then this is hard to see, but basically now it's got trees growing on what had been totally submerged, except for two foot towers, and so now it's just become a landmass, right? Okay, and you'll see this better on the when you see on Blackboard. So David Gaines, a scientist and environmentalist, started an effort to save Mono Lake with some other scientists and environmentalists. He was doing some research in the area, quit his teaching job, and formed the Mono Lake Committee to try to save it. And that's David Gaines. This actually is the newspaper that's reporting on the California Supreme Court decision, National Audubon Society versus Superior Court, and they took a picture of him floating in the lake reading about the case. Anyway, okay, by the way, this is the 1970s, so it is what it is. This case, 1970s is California, right? So if you're like, it was weird, that's just what people were, so we're looking like it back then. All right, so, all right, and I am not showing you my junior high pictures from the 70s, that would be bad. All right, so they formed this effort, this Mono Lake Committee. They started with a research group, and then by 78 they formed a committee based on their research on the overall ecology and the species that were depending on the lake. And so the idea was to use the public trust doctrine to try to achieve legal protection for the Mono Lake. And so the public trust doctrine is this idea that there are certain resources. And so in ancient Rome, it was air, it was running water, navigable water, it was the oceans and the seashore, but these certain environmental resources on which all human life depends, arguably all biological life depends, and certainly on which society depends, are held by the government, but in trust for the people. And there are inherent limitations on the government's authority to harm or waste or dissipate those resources or to transfer them to private parties, and the government has certain fiduciary duties to the public. Okay, so it's a trust, so that means there are fiduciary duties, right? Government is a trustee. The navigable waters, okay, so how does it develop in the U.S.? Okay, there's a famous case involving the lakefront of Chicago, and the U.S. Supreme Court says navigable waters and their submerged lands are subject to the public trust. Okay? By the way, there's another case, it's a Phillips Petroleum case out of the state of Mississippi, that was decided, I think, in the 80s, where the U.S. Supreme Court says, well, historically, in both ancient Rome and England, that was also tidal water, so water subject to the ebb and flow of the tide, so even if those waters are not navigable, they also are subject to the public trust. But what we care about is navigable waters and their submerged land. And so the people of the state of California, the beneficiaries, the government's the trustee, and the object of the trust or the trust properties, navigable lands and submerged lands. However, this public trust doctrine was in tension with the prior appropriation doctrine, which said, once you divert water for a beneficial use, you have rights in perpetuity to that same amount of water based on your priority among all the people who have been diverting water based on when you did it. So in this particular case, the Los Angeles has a priority date of 1940. There are probably some people out there, some ranchers or farmers or whatever in the up in the Sierra Nevadas and the Mono Basin that have priorities that go back to the 1800s, where they're watering their livestock or farming or something. But obviously, Los Angeles secured a whole bunch of rights, 100,000 acre-feet in essence, in 1940. And so the theory behind that is those are property rights. They're secure, they're absolute, they're protected. And so LA's view is we have these prior appropriation rights. Don't talk to us about the public trust doctrine. Okay? And so this is basically about the public trust doctrine, system priority, first in time, first in right, etc. And then I've already talked to you about the public trust doctrine in the Illinois Central Railroad case, and so forth. So what happens is the Mono Lake Committee and some other environmental groups, like the National Audubon Society and the Friends of the Earth, sue the LA Department of Water and Power using a law firm, Morrison Foerster, big firm, okay? And everybody knows what everybody calls Morrison and Foerster? Mofo? Nobody's oh my gosh, you guys need to get out more. Everybody judges, senior partners, okay, so that's so. All right, and they had a UC Berkeley undergrads and law students who helped them, and they tried to compromise with the Department of Water and Power. That didn't work, so they file in state trial court this public trust lawsuit, and eventually works its way up to the California Supreme Court, and everybody expected that LA would win. Prior appropriation rights are sacrosanct in California. Actually, all throughout the West. I mean, LA secured these water rights 43 years earlier. This is water that is supplying the needs of the people, of the public of Los Angeles. And like, who are these upstart environmentalists with the crazy wild hair that are saying we need to protect the birds at Mono Lake, right? Everybody expected LA to win, and they didn't. This was a big surprise victory for the Mono Lake Committee. And it was made a famous landmark case. Now, what the California Supreme Court did is they ordered the State Water Board to reconsider the Department of Water and Power's water rights in light of the public trust doctrine. They didn't say the water rights were illegitimate. They didn't cut back the water rights. They didn't say how much water LA gets. All they said is the Water Board has a fiduciary duty to consider the public trust doctrine. They had failed to do so. Not only had they failed to do so, they said they didn't have the authority to do so. And the California Supreme Court says wrong. You not only have the authority to do so, you have the duty to do so. And water rights need to be constantly reevaluated in light of these public trust responsibilities. And so they said neither doctrine is paramount, but you have to consider water rights in light of public trust values. Moreover, those public trust values include ecology and aesthetics of navigable waters. The feeder streams were not navigable, but Mono Lake was, and the taking of water from the feeder streams was directly affecting Mono Lake, not indirectly, but directly, right? And so they said the state has an ongoing duty to protect the public trust, including revisiting these property rights. But they said we don't dictate any particular allocation of the water, and they left the task to the Water Board. So then there's another phase of litigation. There are two cases, California Trout 1 and California Trout 2. We've talked about this before. You can't really sue in the name of a species, but a lot of times the courts will allow it, or some of the time the courts will allow it as sort of a proxy for the human environmental groups that are suing, right? But of course it's got sort of PR benefit of saying that you're suing on behalf of the California Trout. And what's happened here is the Mono Lake Committee and its other environmental group collaborators were using the California Fish and Game Code to sue for water flow in the feeder streams to maintain fish populations. Trout fishing is important in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Anybody ever done it? You've ever done trout fishing? Okay, important. It's protected by the state under state statute ages ago, and so this became another sort of surprise victory, or set of surprise victories from the Mono Lake Committee. So the court says there has to be a technical committee created to establish interim flow releases and restoration plans in order to maintain the fish. So this is supposed to go on between 90 and 94. However, the LA Department of Water and Power was stubborn. Okay, so now they've lost 3 major cases publicly, like everybody knows this, and yet the LA Department of Water and Power says these are LA's water rights. We're not giving them up. This is too costly to do anything. The scientists who are providing restoration plans, their science is ridiculous and a bunch of bunk, and we don't agree with it. Okay, court, you have ordered us to do certain restoration activities, so we're going to send our workers out there to do what you ordered, but they're only going to work part days. So it just drags it on, right, and so forth. So yeah, we sent somebody, but they only worked a couple hours, and then they went home, and so forth. They said, let's just let nature take its course as opposed to humanly restore this. And they just found all sorts of delay. Every time the Mono Lake Committee went back to court, the LA Department of Water and Power bring out all the lawyers to fight and ask for delays and extensions and continuances and so on and so forth. So in the court, actually, the court's kind of got irritated with LA, but it basically meant a very slow and difficult restoration process. So that leads us to then, there we were, okay? And by this point, we're now in the mid-90s, okay? So the LA has been withdrawing the water from the 1940s. They've been withdrawing a lot of it since 1970. This California Supreme Court issues its National Audubon Society opinion in 1983, and we are now in the mid-90s with things not happening. Eventually, there's this big breakthrough, and then the question is, how did it happen? So that is what we're going to pick up at the beginning of class on Wednesday, and then use that to transition into talking about, in the context of grasslands and prairie dogs, how you might engage private parties, and what are the limits to that, okay? So that's what we're doing, all right?